we are again, another Friday, Tim.
Boy, isn't it? I've been teaching students, and I thought students would stop surprising me, but they continue to do so. And not just students, but also the world around us. Well, and I think the rest of the world can agree with me. The last 4 years have taught us that pretty much nothing is set in stone.
Well, here's how I look at that. If you weren't surprised by something new, even with all of your years, then you would not be a good project manager, because that means you've stopped learning. And for those people who think they've seen it all, they have not, unless they've stopped looking for it all. So,
oh boy, I think I knew when I first started as a project manager, I think I knew about 5% of what I know now. Let me give you a couple examples. So in what was it, 1997 or 1998, I was launching an IT organization inside of a transportation corporation. The IT organization was being pulled out of finance, right? And they had the Teamsters Union as their workers. And what do you know, in 1997 or 1998, I don't remember which year, there was a strike. Guess what I did for 2 weeks? I lost about 25 pounds moving boxes from the warehouse to home. And by the time we'd moved all the boxes, the union strike was over and I could get back to work.
so then you got to haul them all back again?
No, that was somebody else's job. I have one more story, but go ahead.
No, I was going to say that's a great segue into what we want to talk about today, which is dealing with changes and update, whatever it is, in terms of the business environment that we're often caught in. So why don't we use that as a segue, do your next little vignette, and then we'll see where that takes us.
Yeah, I call these things pivots. It's not a change. It's like you are moving forward and there is a destination. When you're inside of a corporation, there's an objective. There's a corporate objective, there's an organizational objective, and there's a project objective, and you're focused on that and that alone. So here I was managing 3 projects in Manhattan. I was doing it from my home here, my home office. And all of a sudden, one morning, I see on the news a couple planes go into the World Trade Center. What am I going to do? It's a travesty for thousands of people, and we've never recovered as a nation. But on the same point, I had 3 guys there who were working in one of the sub-basements of one of the buildings. We couldn't talk to them for 3 days. We found out later that they were off work because it was a holiday for the company that they were working on, and they were just lucky. We found out 3 days later they didn't have cell service until they got outside of New York State, and they were able to get out of town within a day. And it was they said that was a life-changing event. But you know what? These changes that come from outside of us are not just these monumental life-changing events. They're small ones, and they're things that we need to keep track of and monitor. And we need to respond in such a way that we keep our focus on the good of the project. How's that for a segue?
Yeah, I mean, typically, think about the story you just told, though, because typically we think of external changes or emphasis on what it is that we do on a day-to-day basis. We tend to think in terms of regulations or legislation, or in my case, often it was a political party change as a result of an election. But yeah, there are certain situations where, for example, the story you just told, many of us on this podcast lived through that. And a lot of our projects were completely affected as a result of that. So yeah, changes can come from anywhere. Maybe that's a great place to start in terms of how do we become aware? How do we become, understanding of the potential external influences that can affect our projects?
That's a really interesting topic. These things that happen to us are not risks. They're unidentified risks, but they've already occurred. They are issues. And I didn't learn until after I've been through a few of these events why the definitions of risks and issues are the way they are. Number one, a risk might happen. It's a future event. And if it does, it will impact. And you plan it as such. An issue is here and now. It has occurred or it is occurring right now, and it might impact. So that's the big question. How do you find these issues before they impact you?
Well, that is a great question, because like you, when I was starting out as a project manager, we would bid, we would present our schedule, and you sit there as a project manager. My whole job is to stay on schedule, stay on time, deliver quality, and everything is going to go hunky-dory. and you don't think, and over time I've learned that stuff happens. I mentioned earlier, I've been in situations where, for example, an election happened and we went from either a more conservative party to a more progressive party, or vice versa. And they will look at the project that you are doing in their name, because they're the ones funding it, as something that maybe they need to overturn or change to put their flavor on it. That doesn't, when it comes to your schedule, they have just upended your schedule. So that's one example of just something like an election, which we know comes every so often. An election can overturn and change things drastically for your project.
So the question is, how do you become aware of these things that are issues that you're not aware of yet? This is the only thing I could do. This is the only thing I could figure out. Go through it once blind.
Yeah.
And then you put it in your risk register template for future projects. I am a student of mistakes and a student of unintended consequences. And that's the only thing that has saved me and allowed me to become as successful as I am.
You kind of have to watch for that, because, and I was fortunate, I had mentors.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things, we're using that same example. Elections come every 4 years in this country. Therefore, be prepared. I've had situations where, for example, the executive sponsor who wrote the funding documents to get us in line with what's happening took a promotion to a whole other organization and did not leave the project vision, with their deputy or with us. And so you sit there and go, well, now what do we do, right? So there's all sorts of things that can happen that have nothing to do with the normal things that you track in your risk register.
Yeah, and that's the issue. How do we actually look at a business environment and say we are prepared for the organization, the business, and the environment around us, including politics and the community? I have undergrad and graduate degrees in business, and they took us through these scenarios and they gave us tools. We use the tools for, an organized analysis that we regularly do. I applaud whoever was with you and actually taught you to prepare for these things. Most of us don't have such mentors.
Well, and then you end up in situations, and the projects that I tended to work on were fairly lengthy in duration. You get a situation where suddenly you end up with that vacuum at the top, and I equate it to something like, we've come through a hurricane season, and where a lot of people lost roofs on their houses. Well, suddenly everyone and their favorite dog becomes a expert roofer. And you end up with, you have to kind of put your antenna on and say, okay, I have a vacuum in. Now who's going to be my expert roofer? Who's going to come in and try to save the day? Do I follow that person, or do I in fact try to protect the assets of the project and the vision that was planted? That was a good vision, perhaps. So it's all of those things. It's not just things that can happen. It's also having those antenna up and being aware and being ready to handle them at the same time.
So what you're saying is, it's not so necessarily being prepared for any specific event per se,
Yeah.
but it's having tools and processes that you pull out that are general use that you know that you can use to build the appropriate tools and responses for any such event.
That, and also just common sense. How many times have we said, as project managers, you can pull all the tools you want, but if you're applying them rotely, as opposed to with common sense, right? It still comes down to the fact that you have to have common sense and just apply it to any kind of situation. That's kind of my go-to. And the common sense, by the way, wasn't there on day one. It came after many, many experiences.
It's critical thinking. It's analysis. It's pumping the brake before you respond. And I hope that we can talk about that a little bit more further on. But you know what? The question is, how do we stay vigilant? How do we stay on top of our game and keep an eye on the event so that, we're not triggered on a Tuesday afternoon with something that happened Monday? How do we do this? Is it just practice and making mistakes and learning how to clean up?
It's some of that, and some of that comes with experience. But I think the other thing that I have learned when I was a fairly new project manager, I learned to delegate, but I had to do so much myself because after all, this was my project, right? Well, the more a project manager immerses themselves into a situation so that you're just doing, the schedule and the budget and all that sort of thing, and not kind of stepping away a little bit and kind of looking around the landscape, you're going to miss these things. If you allow others to help you, if you don't get yourself so immersed in the day-to-day that you forget to look around once in a while, you will miss these things. Something as simple as reading a newspaper or reading governmental reports as to what's happening around us. The example I was going to use was in a large Midwestern state. During the economic downturn of 2008, our CIO happened to notice that many hundreds, maybe thousands of people were running out of their unemployment insurance benefits and needed to be taken care of in a way until they could get full-time employment again, but they needed their basic needs met. And so as a result of that, we were working on a public assistance project. And a result of that, we changed things to prepare for the onslaught of those who were losing their unemployment insurance benefits. Had that person not sort of looked up from their day-to-day, read a government report, read some newspapers, looked around and seen what was happening, they would have missed what was coming down the pipe. Fortunately, we were able to make some serious, significant changes and be ready for those people so that we could help them until full-time employment came again.
Wow. So what you're talking about is being able to see the individual processes and the individual activities where mistakes can occur, but being able to relate it back to this big picture vision that you're keeping in the back of your mind.
Exactly. Precisely. And again, I cannot reiterate this often enough. And I think you've probably been there too. As a junior, when you were a junior project manager, you want to make such a good mark on the project, you forget to look up from your desk once in a while.
This is a tool that we don't normally talk about in project management, but it is discussed in business management. It's called systems thinking. It's organizing your thoughts and your processes and your attitude around the big picture, something complex that looks like a black box, and then being able to break it down as a set of functions, and then the functions as a bunch of processes. So as you have to troubleshoot or analyze, you can jump from the big black box to the functions, to the processes, to do your analysis and your troubleshooting. But you're right. If you're stuck in the work, if you're not delegating, you're not going to have time to think about that black box. You're just putting patches on the tire as you're going down the freeway.
And the worst place as a project manager to be is in reactive mode. You want to be ahead. No, you cannot. There's no way that you can predict what's about to come down every time, right? We could not predict 9/11. We as project managers, we could not predict a lot of things that can happen to our projects. The only thing we can predict, and I forget who said this, but the only constant in project management is change.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's not being prepared for any specific event, but having that general event preparation so that as we observe the deviations from the objective, the deviations from project success, we can actually, number one, keep the thing moving. And if we don't keep the thing moving, we don't panic. We have work stoppage, and we bring the smartest and the brightest together and figure out what we're going to do next as a group. That's the only thing we can do sometimes.
And the other thing is, and I've tried to do this on every project. In fact, I've been fairly successful, and that is to maintain those very solid collaborative relationships with those you are serving, so that when something like that happens, there is a collaborative effort to also solve the problem. Because sometimes we as project managers can't solve it without our executive sponsor helping us.
See, that's what I wanted to talk to you about, because I was taught in business school that when you're analyzing the environment outside of your domain, you want to do a quick assessment on a regular basis, and you use acronyms, right? Use TPOC or PESTLE. PESTLE's a common one that reminds you, okay, what's happening politically, environmentally, socially, technologically, legally, and economically, right? And you're thinking, but you just said something that really important: relationships.
Oh yeah.
How do relationships help you, number one, become aware of these external events that can influence your project? Number two, manage them potentially.
Well, I think in the first place, and by the way, I have also been on projects where the relationship was not very good. So there was a little bit of conflict. So then when something like this happens, there's more reluctance to basically come together and help each other. So in terms of the relationship, in terms of what's going on, if we maintain that relationship where we're fostering the ability to help, why do I do that? Because I want to show my value and I want to maintain that relationship. And I have been in those situations where an external influence happened to the project, not on the project, but to the project, such that the schedule or the project itself could be knocked off its moorings. Because we had a strong relationship with our client base and our executive sponsor, we came together as a team. What we could solve, we did. What they could help us with, they did, and we came together and solved the problem. So that's a long answer to say, yes, relationships are very important, strong relationships.
And I've discovered the same. When you do have major disruptions, even minor ones, relationships and how you work with other people seem to solve problems a lot easier than looking up in books or searching the internet. That's just time waster. That's almost procrastination. Building, again, like you said, doing things outside of schedule, doing things that may not have direct value to the work, can actually lead you to success. It's creating that environment in your work that says, I have your back, and this is what good people do.
Well, there's that, and there's, I come back to the common sense or the wisdom aspects that we build over time as project managers. A lot of times the information that you find on the internet or that you read in a book comes from people who are very scholarly, but who have never done it. And if they've never done it and never experienced it and never realized how many different directions something can hit you from, I can take their educated advice, but I would prefer to have experiential advice.
It's just like COVID. We could have talked about this 5 years ago what would the planet do, and what could the United States do, and what could we do as individual project managers if a virus spread across the planet such that it shut it down for a year or two, right? But going through this, we have that visceral knowledge now that is just built into our culture. It's no longer a script or a checklist. It's like we know what to do. We have this one.
Yeah. Before we leave this particular topic, because we're kind of saying how can we become aware? We also want to talk about how do we respond? But let me offer this one more thing in terms of how can we become aware? And I'm going to kind of go back on myself a little bit in terms of project managers being in the weeds. I have over the years learned to be in the weeds enough so that I know the requirements of the project backwards and forwards. And then when something hits us as an external negative influence, perhaps sometimes a positive, but typically a negative influence, unless I understand my requirements, how do I know how that external influence is going to affect my project? So I allow myself to be in the weeds to the point where I understand my requirements inside out. I'm not necessarily with my sleeves rolled up, determining, elaborating on those requirements, but I have my sleeves rolled up enough to know that when something hits the project, I know exactly where it's going to hit and what it's going to affect.
This is a good pivot point in our talk here to talk about, number one, how to become aware, and number two, how do we respond? Let's not talk about world-shaking events. Let's just talk about issues that are like when. Let me tell you, here's one that's not so crucial, but it is sort of serious. Back in the late 1990s, I was an IT director for a small state agency, and the governor's office called me and said, "Okay, Tim, I need you to tell me on the phone right now how you're going to no longer use social security numbers of the people in your databases as primary keys. How are you going to use that as not a lookup number and keep them secure against people who could grab it?" So that actually put me on guard, and it took me about 3 or 4 minutes of talking to this nice gentleman and figuring out what had to happen and what our roadmap looked like. What would you do if somebody called up and said, "Okay, your project has a serious flaw. Here's what we need to do," or "Tell me what you're going to do right now"? What would you do?
So here's where I would go back immediately to project management fundamentals. Now, does he want the answer right there on the telephone? That can get you in a lot of trouble, because you can do a knee-jerk response, then you have to live up to it if it happens to be uninformed, right? So the first thing I would do is probably ask for a little time to do the analysis. But when it really comes down to it, the way you describe this particular situation, that would be a change to the project. Depending on what phase you're in. If you've already got your database design, now you've got to go back all the way down to the depths of your database and redesign that part of it, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, you need to buy yourself a little time, analyze the change, analyze it against the project requirements, and be prepared to document it in such a way that then you can present it in a much more informed position, and let the person know truthfully how much that's going to affect the timelines, the schedule, the cost, everything. So yeah, project management fundamentals is what I would resort to.
I always look for a common business metric. With a lot of my projects, I deliver either content or some physical asset or some service, right? And I look at either, if I'm deep in the project with a firm schedule, I'm looking at project progress and status. And then if I'm not so firm in the project, it's early on, I can actually look at velocity, the rate at which we're progressing, if I don't have a lot of data. So using one or those others, I look at prioritization, basically. Break down the problem, like you said. I would love to break down the problem, look at the facets, look at the various components, because there's usually not one component, and then prioritize and figure out which ones are the primary items. And again, work stoppage is work stoppage, and that cannot be helped sometimes. You're going to have to share that information on a regular basis.
I had exactly the same thing happen to a couple of my projects that you just described. The social security number not being allowed anymore by edict as an identifying item. And in those situations, we did ask for the extra time. We did submit a change request. But here's what's interesting. It wasn't me that derived what's required in the change request. I went to my entire group of people, and I found out that we had more than 100 reports, for example, that had social security number on them. So we had 100 reports plus that we had to scrub. We had notifications that went out to clients of the agency that had their social security number on those. We had to scrub notifications. We had all of the training data, all of the training specs out there. We were already beginning some of our training. We had to scrub all of our training documentation to show that the SSN is no longer on the screens. So if you think about that, because I brought in the entire group, I was able to give an informed response to the person asking. And yes, there was a delay, but we were also able, and here's the trick, I think, Tim, we were also able to say, but while we're working on this, we will continue working over here so that we won't have stoppage. And that assuaged their, their concerns a little bit. Yes, we had to add dollars to the project. We had to add a little bit of timeline, but we kept it moving, and we kept it moving transparently.
Very good. Yeah, that transparency, that's the big piece. Making sure that people understand, yes, we're slowing down. Yes, there is a good reason we're slowing down. We're actually, number one, making things better. And number two, we're focusing on our attention on something that is very critical that we must attend to right now. And then we'll be back on our way.
Now, fortunately, IT has moved on a lot since then as well. So, if I had to scrub 100 reports today, I'd probably do it in one place as opposed to 100 places. But nonetheless, until we described the fact that we had 100 reports to scrub, the size of the request was not understood by the requestor. That's where the transparency comes in.
And that's the thing. It's no sin for a project manager to say, we don't know how big this is, and we don't know how monumental this task. This is our domain. This is our world that we can influence. These are the things that we can and cannot do. We can't change the weather. we can't miraculously turn this number into a non-identifying number. But at the same point, we can give you that response in a very efficient manner. Very quick.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the more basic examples. I mean, there's hundreds of different kinds of examples like the one you gave that can hit a project, and we just have to be prepared to say, let me take a breath and get back to you with informed data.
See, that's the thing. That's proper communication. So in our work, I think there are undiscoverable events that happen, but I think we can prepare within our own industries for certain things that we might occur. And that's where I think that we need to look at not just our risk, not just our issue management, but also our risk management with these issues.
Well, and also our contingency planning and that sort of thing. Now, that was always a tricky thing for the companies that I worked with, because we would have to bid fixed price. So if you put in too much contingency, you didn't know if someone would come in and underbid you because they didn't put in any or enough contingency. So yeah, there's always that tricky part. But I think there are some project management principles that we can apply to even head off some of those things that can hit a project, because something somewhere along the line is going to hit your project.
Yes, there is. For example, I have a project where I'm delivering a series of classes, and 2 weeks before delivery, the primary client contact said, "Oh, by the way, I'm not going to be available for the next 6 weeks. I'm going to put somebody else in charge of the review of the documentation." And we had maybe 800 pages to deliver in 4 weeks. And the poor gentleman who received that, the only thing he could say was, "I can receive these documents, but I need 4 or 5 experts to help me." And this was near the end of the project, and there was no way to extend this project. And so again, these are times where we have to, number one, we have to assess, and we have to manage the communication and manage the expectations and manage the engagement if we cannot manage the work. What's going on in your world that is actually changing things? I know you have a much more broad vision than my projects.
I think in our world, we're just the project that I'm helping, that I'm advising on right now. We're just exiting the discovery phase and going into the implementation, where we're doing a lot of really refinement of what we discovered during the discovery phase. And it's interesting how we'd ask the system integrator to bid the project in a fixed price manner. And the discovery phase opened up several things that could have been, or arguably could not have been, known during the bid process. So what's happening in my world right now is we're dealing with issues that one side feels may be out of scope, the other side feels may be in scope. And so we're working through those. But talk about change, I don't think the system integrator expected the extra requirements from their perspective that came through, whereas the client said, no, it's very clear that you need to do that. So yeah, we're always having a lot of fun in terms of scope issues. That's probably the bane of our existence when we do these projects.
Is this generally your experience on these larger projects, that you get ready, you prepare for these discussions of scope and these discussions of changed expectations?
Yeah, it does vary. I have been involved in situations where I've actually written the requirements on behalf of my client, that their subject matter experts then came in and reviewed and altered, updated, whatever. But because that was my day job, and I wasn't distracted by other things happening, I was able to truly go through and prepare a really detailed list of requirements. So in those situations, we had fewer problems of scope. Typically, if we had scope issues at that point, it's because some new legislative mandate came in during the delivery of the project. But other than that, it just depends on how detailed and how well refined your requirements are going into those bids.
I don't want to beg the question, but it sounds like, once again, having that big strategic view of the project seems to have helped you, and maintaining that view seems to have helped you, not just on this certain event, but it's just a general rule of thumb that guides you in a lot of these.
Well, it is. When I was on the system integration side, we learned to go through the request for proposal requirements in such a way that we asked every single question we could come up with to make sure we understood. When I'm on the other side writing those requirements, I'm thinking, what questions am I about to be asked? And can I preempt them by putting in very detailed requirements? So when I look at it from that perspective, again, it comes down to learning over time and experience.
Very good. Very good. Another area that we have changes in are changes in technology. Do you remember during lockdown when Zoom became the communication flavor of the month, and everybody using Teams and WebEx were in a hustle to see if they could move over to Zoom?
I do remember that. Yeah. And I'm laughing a little bit because unfortunately, during some of that time, a lot of our subject matter experts were not used to that form of technology. And some of the funny stories that came out of those initial Teams or Zoom meetings are just hilarious. So, I remember when Zoom came out. Now, fortunately, in my experience, because I'm also part of the National Speakers Association and Toastmasters, we have learned over time also to use these technologies to enhance our ability to present. But when you have neophytes, it becomes fun. Or
Well,
maybe
yeah,
it's funny.
yeah, and again, we're looking at these tools that all of a sudden, people are paying attention to what they're using to get the work done, and they're missing the reason those tools are there.
Yeah.
And that's the frustrating part. One of the things that I've observed is there's always a current flavor of the month, and everybody, just because of human nature, are always looking at the newest and the brightest penny. If you remember the same thing, you were talking about, all of a sudden everybody becomes an expert roofer overnight when you have a hurricane, right? Do you remember the millennium bug and going through that as well?
Oh my goodness, I lived that one. Yes.
And we have the confusion and chaos at the executive level. What's going on, and is our business going to shut down? Is the world going to stop? And then we have everybody saying, hey, I'm a COBOL expert, I can fix the old code. How did you actually maintain continuity and gravitas through all that confusion? I struggled with that myself.
We struggled. I was working in corporate at that time, and we very quickly allied ourselves with a couple of companies that had some, and I forget what they called them, but they were code generation tools that could walk through existing code, make some changes on our behalf, and then allow us to test it. So they were able to short circuit a lot of what it was that we had to do, because they already had technology in place. I don't think they were preparing for Y2K. That's the situation we're talking about. But I think they had code that they could figure out how to use to mitigate the Y2K situation. People look back now and they say, "Oh, it was just a big nothing." Oh, no. We mitigated. We changed some code that would have caused huge problems had it allowed us to go past the Y2K time period.
Yeah, and of course nothing was going to stop, and nothing was going to blow up or anything. But it was fascinating to see the process that everybody was going through as a culture, and as businesses, and as tactical actions and processes to actually fix this problem. And I learned through going through that Y2K dance that there are things that people have to do culturally, and there are things that we have to do as a business to wrap our heads around this. And then we also have to give the people who are the experts the space to solve the problem. All three of those needs need to be met.
Yeah, and I look at us as being quite fortunate, because we did ally ourselves with some very strong technical companies. But if you think about it, a lot of companies came through that with flying colors just because they did, as you said, they stopped, they took pause, they looked around and says, what are my first priorities, second priorities, third priorities? Let's tackle them. Everybody go. And again, cooler heads prevailed.
So what's happening right now that could potentially totally upset your projects and your business? Is there anything going on that you're watching?
Yeah, we're the whole idea of artificial intelligence, I think, is one that probably we're not quite understanding yet how it can affect us. And we're looking at it from a positive approach, because there are, something as simple as a chat bot is an early AI product, right? Something
Mhm.
so that if I roll out something to my client base and they can get onto a chat bot and get some questions answered while they're doing their application process or whatever it is, there's some sort of AI built into that chatbot. So we're already using some of those, but I think the latest progression in AI is something that we're still watching very carefully as to how we can turn that around and make it very positive for our projects.
This is not an evolutionary change. This is a disruption. This is a revolutionary change in the way technology is assisting us, and we don't know the impact yet. And
Yeah.
here's my problem. I get these things that are happening around the project and in the technology and in the culture, and it's what people are talking about. And so I've found myself, even if AI is not going to influence my projects, I have to be well versed in it. I have to be able to have my experts I can rely on, and I can respond to these so people can get back to work instead of talking about these, again, these shiny pennies that are constantly showing up.
Yeah, and as long as we can look at it from how can it help me, then why not use something to advance us? At the same point, that if there's areas of artificial intelligence that are negative, then let's figure out how to avoid those. But they're not going away, and that's what I think. That's what you were saying.
Yeah, and we're thinking that these things are thinking processes and thinking tools, and I think that's giving them a little too much credit.
Yeah.
But we can't think of them as Google either, and we still have to play with this, not just as the technical experts who are designing it, not just those people playing. I think people as a culture, just like we played with Zoom in COVID and lockdown, I think we as a community of humanity need to play with these to find out how this fits in and how it works. We don't know yet.
We don't, and but it's one of those things again. And this is interesting from a project management perspective, because I think we started in the podcast in terms of how do we become aware of external influences. Well, here is an external influence that we are all aware of. I think GPT, Chat GTP.
Yeah, that's one of the ones.
So we're aware of it now. We don't know yet what that means to us, but as project managers, it's up to us to not just be aware, but now to educate ourselves. As it progresses, we progress. And as it finds different ways, and I'll give you an example. I had a friend who was putting together a presentation, and he asked Chat GPT, am I saying that right? Is it GPT or GTP?
It's GPT.
GPT. So he asked it in terms of what are the top 10 and whatever it was. Well, it spit out top 10, and he looked at it and he goes, well, I teach these 8. These 2 don't really apply, so I'm going to throw them away. So it's something that he used to shortcut what he needed, but it was not something to replace what he was teaching. So if we look at it from that perspective, he did it exactly correctly for himself. And that it just makes sense. Again, back to common sense, back to applying what it is that we need to do to look at these tools, but use them as tools, not as substitutes for our own sweat and tears in some cases.
Yeah, in the education community, we're talking about this, and we say it's great for context. It's great to connect it to what's going on and how it can influence things, but it can't take the place of actually, turning that context into action. There's still a role for humans. This takes days and sometimes weeks of conversation and debate before you actually can come to a conclusion.
Well, and you had mentioned systems thinking before, and I remember reading when this first kind of came to light. And I remember reading about a student who had used it to prepare a paper for him. And he presented the paper and got a very high mark on the paper, but he hadn't done anything. So if I look at systems thinking, or if I look at critical thinking skills, he allowed a tool to substitute for his own learning and his own development. So who's the poorer for that? He is. He may have gotten an A or an A or a 4.0 on his paper, but that didn't help him. So where's the educational process? We have to think in those terms as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And where Google and other searches and search engines helped us with recognition. Oh, I remember that, right? That's your memorization.
Yeah.
I think ChatGPT is going to help us with connecting the dots and putting in context, but we still need education. And actually, this really is exciting for us, where we can actually say, as long as we can validate what they're doing, and we have to learn how to validate, that's your learning critical thinking. We can actually say, let's not focus on this recognition and comprehension. That can be done automatically. Let's focus on putting these things into action and get our hands dirty and play with them. And I'm in the process of launching a series of classes based just on that, not actually teaching people by rote and memorizing, processes and inputs and outputs, but actually, here's a problem we have, here's the context, here's the data. What do we do? And basically be able to build a classroom environment such that, the variables are constantly changing. So like you said, these events are not so scary. It's that we have to, like you said, apply common sense and a bit of reasoning to come up with some really good ways of approaching these things. And it's not just, these whiz bang things like Zoom and ChatGPT, but it's also like, we have to protect Social Security numbers. We have only 2 digits for a year, and we're going to have to figure these things out as we go. And we don't know what tomorrow's issues are.
Well, and I even look at something like Agile, which is a kind of a, it's been around for a while, but it hasn't been adopted like the old waterfall methodologies. So what's new in my world the last couple of years is a faster adoption by many of the agencies that I support to Agile processes. And what's happening is a lot of the system integrators come in as those happy roofers, we're the experts, and they really aren't. And so we're learning together again. But Agile also has, in many cases, turned the world of developing systems upside down for the better, but it was disruptive. It certainly was in my domain, in the domain that I support.
And it continues to be. The academicians are looking at no longer an Agile or a traditional approach to project management. They're seeing it on a spectrum, and they're seeing a conversion of Agile attitude with project management skills. And, we don't know what we're going to have. Maybe with those two things, we can actually focus on that big picture. Not just the big picture of the project, the objective and the vision, but the big picture of focusing on the relationships and where a project manager can actually add the greatest value. And that's my hope, where project managers can actually start seeing these things as an opportunity to release the more day-to-day actions and get them into a more proactive and strategic position.
Well, it's interesting too. I was just looking back. I forget what the reason was, but I was looking back at a previous project and a white paper that I had written as a result of a change that had hit the project. And I looked at that and I thought, how did I know that? I didn't. And then I realized that because I was immersed in the project at that time, and because I was relying on my executive sponsor to support me, and because I had a team behind me that was also very supportive, I was able to pull all of the ideas together into very coherent white paper, present it to the executive, and have it go forward in terms of how our project would turn out. When I look back now and I say, how did I get there? And I realized that had something like that happened to one of my projects today, I would just do the same thing, and I would pull out some sort of common sense approach and just make sure it happens. So yeah, as long as we're always aware, as long as our antenna are always up, And as long as we have our support structure around us, we can solve almost any problem that hits our projects.
Very good. Very good. I think this is a great place to land this show. We've talked about external environmental influences that can impact our project, and we're talking mostly, disruptive ones for the worse or the better. And we have to be aware of that through systems thinking. But again, at the same point, it's the one thing that I've learned from listening to you today is relationship to calm the frayed nerves, as well as to get the experts together and do the best problem solving you can do.
Well, and I think that is important. And it occurred to me that when we've talked about risks and issues in past with these same sorts of challenges for project managers, we've talked about the normal ones that we experience. I think this is the first time we've talked about those disruptive ones that can come out of left field that we've never seen before. And again, it comes down to experience, or relating to or relying on others' experience to get us through those situations.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you. This has been a very enjoyable conversation. I appreciate spending time on this. So where can we find you in the next week if we have questions on this or other topics?
Well, again, on LinkedIn, and what's interesting with LinkedIn is I'm getting a lot of requests now to come in and do some teaching and do some of this. It's fun. I prefer on LinkedIn at this point just to have that conversation, project management conversations, problem solving conversations, but LinkedIn is just a great place for us as IT professionals, I think.
Yeah, it does work. It works very well. It's the one that's maintained its consistency in connecting professionals to professionals. And that's where you'll find me too. I really appreciate your time as well, Merv. This has been a joy, and I can't even predict to think about what we'll be talking about next. We still have a couple more tasks in the exam content outline, and then we're going to have to think about what we're going to talk about next.
Well, that's one thing about the world of project management. It is rich, and you and I have more war stories than we have years on us. So, if maybe we can do the next 10 episodes just on war stories. How have I seen some of these podcasts? Someone will sit there with a glass of scotch and a cigar, and they talk about war stories.
It's always a piece of dessert and a cup of coffee with me. But yeah, I agree with you as well. I think this is going to be a pleasant next series that we'll be talking about.
Well, and for those people who follow us, they can learn as much from what we did wrong as what we did well. And they can apply those to their own situations and learn from that. I would rather learn from someone else making mistakes than make them myself. So
yeah. Well, thanks again. And everybody dialing in, thanks to us as well. Your attention to us just makes us more excited. Your questions to us give us more things to think about and talk about. So let's continue the conversation as we go into another set of questions and answers and discussions. And if you have any ideas on the direction you want us to go, please provide that as well.
Excellent. Until next time.
Thanks again. And thanks, everyone.